So most people get the idea that a tube is only a smallmouth bait, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. If we've learned anything from watching Mark Zona over the years, it's that a tube can be thrown anywhere for anything in any species of bass. And so today what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to break down how I rig a tube and how I go about fishing a tube. I have 5 or 6 different hooks laid out, and I'm going to break down how to rig it from a small little baby Ned tube like this to a full 3.5-inch tube that will help you catch more fish in different situations that you ever thought possible. So stick around, you guys are not going to want to miss this video. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera around and show you how I rig each different tube, so that way it'll kind of get the image in your mind of how you can throw a tube and some of the different situations that you can throw a tube in. And then after that, I'm going to break down where I throw it and what I look for and why I would throw a tube, so that way when you see the situations, you'll then know how to rig it, and then you'll know what to look for as far as how to throw it. And at the end of the video, I'll break down some of the gear that I like to throw a tube on, but let's turn this puppy around and look at how I rig a tube. So the first thing we will start with is we will start with a full-size tube, just because I feel like most people end up throwing a 3.5-inch tube as it is. And this is just a Poor Boys tube, but I also like the Z-Man Easy tube and the Strike King Coffee tube. Those are probably the 3 go-tos. This Poor Boys is just a very, very cheap tube, and you get a giant pack of them, so it's easy to rig a bunch of them up, and if I destroy them, I destroy them. But let's start with how you rig a tube. So I have a few different hook options laid out for rigging a big sized tube, so that way you can see kind of how I go about rigging it. And you have your standard ball head right off the bat, and I like this standard ball head when I'm throwing this tube in less than 5 feet of water. If I'm throwing this tube around sparse grass, if I'm throwing it on sandy patches, if I'm throwing it on rock and it is shallower than 5 feet, I like this 3/16 ounce ball head, for the specific reason that it slides up in super, super easy. You have a nice light wire exposed hook on there, and your hook penetration is going to be really easy, and your hook sets won't have to be anything ridiculous. And it's also super cheap and easy to go through, because when they get hung up in the rocks, which a tube has a tendency to do, you're not going to go breaking the bank by trying to buy new tube jig hooks for it. And so the key to this is wetting the tube and then sticking it up inside of here. And then what I like is that hook is actually just perfectly exposed. All you then have to do is pop this hook, or the eye of the hook, through, tie it on, and you're good to go. But I like that light tube because you get a ton of action out of that bait, and then it also is not going to get as hung up in the rocks. So that is the first hook that I want to talk about. The next hook that I want to talk about is actually 2 of them. I have I have a custom hook, and then I also have a store-bought hook right here. So as you get into throwing a tube, a lot of what people like to do is go to these bigger heads, because you get more action out of the bait because you snap a tube. Like we've all seen Mark Zona do when he cracks that tube. What that's going to do with this heavier weight is that's going to cause that tube to spiral a bunch, and it also gives it a fatter head. And all you would do is just push this up in here like normal, and this is going to allow you to fish that tube in a lot deeper water and also be able to get some crazy reaction strikes out of those fish. And for this, I like to go when it's either super, super flat calm, or I like to go when it's really, really windy. And because that heavier weight is just going to allow you to feel the bottom a little bit easier, but it's also going to give you some crazy reaction strikes. Now, one tube that I really want to talk about is this Trocar weedless tube jig head. And you'll notice that it has a weird bend going on in this hook, and that bend is specifically there to make this tube weedless. And so how you're going to do this is, if you look at this bait, how that tube is going to be rigged is like this. And so you'll have that tube up inside of that head, but you'll see that will lay flat on top. So to rig this tube, it's kind of interesting how you get about rigging it. And so what you do is, if you look at the tube, you can see it's going to be laid in there like this, because it's basically an EWG hook and a tube jig combined. And so to rig this bait, all I'm going to do is insert that hook point through the head like so. You're going to insert that hook point about a little bit behind the nose of the bait, just like so. And then, depending on the length of the lead, that's how far you're going to go down the bait. So you'll insert that hook. So you will insert that hook like so at the nose, go down the length of the lead of the head. So if you're using a bigger lead weight or a heavier head, you're going to have to go down further. If you're using a smaller head, you have to go down less. You'll pop it back through, and then you'll wet this head and then pull it through, just like so. So then you will slide this head inside of the tube like so. Pull that over top of it like that. And then you will pop the eye back through the head like so. And then you can EWG rig it or Texas rig it just like so. So now you can see that tube is rigged perfectly straight. You can pop your eye through, and then you have a weedless tube that you can now throw in and amongst grass and get a much different action out of the bait and keep it super, super weedless. One thing I do like to do to this tube, instead of just popping it through that bottom, which is going to cause that bait to be harder to collapse, as you can see, is I will actually take a pair of scissors and cut a slit in this bottom. Like so. Just take and cut a small slit in the tube like so, so that now when you rig this tube, you only have to go through one layer of plastic as opposed to two. And that's just going to make when you set the hook so much easier for that hook to pop through, because there's less material in the way for that tube to get stuck on like so. For the most part, that is going to be the dominant ways in which I rig a bigger 3.5-inch tube. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition from this bigger tube to this smaller style tube like this Ned tube, and then I also have a Strike King 2.5-inch tube that I'm going to break down a little bit and show you how to rig that as well. So let's talk about these smaller tubes, and spoiler alert, this is a 2 3/4-inch tube, not a 2.5-inch tube. These are my two small go-to tube baits for the specific reason that they get a ton of bites and they fish really different than a bigger tube actually does. So the way I rig both of these is for the smaller tube, the Strike King tube that's hollow up inside, most of the time I'm just going to run a 3/16 ball head in this tube, because it just happens, it fits perfect, you get a great hookup ratio, and it fits amazing inside of there and gives it great, great action. And it's super cheap to run. What I also will do is I will run a Nedlock EWG hook on there, because this is a great way to rig a tube and make it weedless on these smaller tubes that you pretty much never would otherwise get to do. And so again, to rig that, it's super, super simple. You just pop that up through, bring that up like that, and then now you have a small weedless tube, and you would think that would take away a lot of the action, but it surprisingly doesn't. It actually gives you a ton of action, and it gives you a weedless option for this smaller tube, which is super, super nice when you're fishing around thick grass or thick grass patches, especially for you northern guys, or if you're fishing around any type of wood, because now you get a lifelike crayfish action with the spiraling effect where you're not going to get hung up nearly as often. So when do I like to go from a small tube to a bigger style tube, or vice versa? And the real key is going to be in the size of the fish and the pressure of the fishery. So gobies are primarily what drives tube actions. You know, that's primarily why people will throw a tube if there's a lot of gobies in that lake. But what people don't do is they don't throw it around grass nearly as often because it tends to get hung up. But that's when I really like to go to tubes, because these tubes, having a slick body design, go through grass a lot easier. And so if you're on a northern fishery that has a lot of hydrilla, a lot of milfoil, clean water specifically, and grass and hard spots mixed in, a tube just does a phenomenal job at fishing through that type of cover, because it goes in and out so much easier, and with the spiraling and darting action, it triggers those fish a lot easier. And so it's a great cold water bait for when you're first fishing in the spring and you're really trying to get on top of those fish that have seen a lot of baits, or you just have like 10 foot of visibility with grass and you're like, I don't know what to throw in these situations. That's when I like to go to a tube, because it just looks so dang natural that it can't help but trigger those fish. And so if I am fishing for largemouth, a lot of times I'm going to reach for that 3.5-inch tube, just because they're largemouth and they really don't care as much. They're not as pressured as far as like tube style baits go. So that tube action is just going to be something that they're going to jump on right away anyway. And then if I'm fishing for smallmouth, if I'm fishing deeper, I like to go to this bigger style tube, or if I'm fishing for an above average size smallmouth, that bigger size tube is going to get me that bite. Now, if I'm fishing on a pressured fishery, say I'm on the St. Lawrence, I am on St. Clair, I am somewhere where those fish see a lot of tubes, or if I am somewhere where I think they've seen a lot of pressure, I will downsize and go to these smaller tubes, just because I think I'm going to get more bites because of it. and I'm going to be able to cover water a little bit easier with that bait. I will also, if I've worked through an area, say I have like 2 or 3 rock piles that are money, there's loaded on there, and I've been hitting them with this tube, all of a sudden I'm not getting as many bites, then downsize and go to smaller tubes, because that's going to be what really gets you more bites, and it might even get you a couple bigger bites in that pressure. I really only throw 2 colors when it comes to tubes. I like smoke and I like green pumpkin. Other than that, I'm really not going to mix in a lot of different colors. I like to keep it really, really simple. And the rod that I like to throw this bait on is actually that 7-1 Arc Invoker Tour series that we just came out with. It's got a nice up handle grip on it, and so that it's that above handle grip, so I can actually hold it and get a lot of leverage when I'm snapping that bait. And I still like to run braid to a leader with the tube, but you have to be aware that you don't have as much flex with braid to a leader as you do with straight fluorocarbon, so I don't have to move it as much to be able to get that tube to move as much. But you want a little bit stiffer rod to be able to get that hook to penetrate into that fish's mouth, because tubes do have a little bit bigger hook on them, and so if you go to a softer rod, you will end up losing fish. Which is why when you watch Mark Zona snap a tube, he sets the hook like 3 or 4 times, because he's burying it in the roof of that fish's mouth. Because a lot of times they tend to eat a tube and hold really, really tight. And so if you're throwing it on a spinning rod in finesse gear, you're going to lose those fish, because a lot of people just don't get the hook penetration with the tube. So I upsize a lot of times. I will go to 8 to 10 pound fluorocarbon leader. I like that 8 to 10 pound Cortland Master Braid with that Arc Invoker Tour rod we talked about. And it's a deadly combination when you get around the right scenarios and the right conditions. So hopefully this helps you guys understand a little bit better about how to throw a tube, where to throw a tube, and the gear to throw a tube on. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you like today's content and you want to see a little bit more, hit that subscribe button to follow along. But God bless every single one of you guys, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.